Hello, I'm Jim Martin, Chairman of the 60 Plus Association, representing 7 million seniors. Welcome to our panel on overall tax reform, but specifically our panel will focus, laser-like, on the highly debated tax that's often labeled the estate or death tax. You could expect a lively exchange. But before I turn the mic over to our tax pros, it's worth noting that the estate or death tax has been imposed for military defense purposes 4 times in our nation's young history. Intended as a temporary tax on the wealthy, it was always quickly repealed the first 3 times. Enacted in 1797 to build up our naval forces, repealed 1802. Enacted again in 1862 to help pay for the Civil War, repealed 1870. Enacted a 3rd time in 1898 to pay some of the Spanish-American War costs, repealed a 3rd time in 1902. Reimposed a 4th time in 1916 to help pay for World War I. But here we are 100 years later, not yet repealed, leading some to note that the sole survivor from this war is this tax. And the argument that repeal is a tax cut for the rich is highly debatable in light of the fact that the wealthy are rarely impacted, since the rich across the political spectrum, liberal and conservative alike, they pay pricey lawyers, if you will, to protect their assets. But the other pros and cons need addressing. Is the tax a revenue raiser or a net revenue loser? Does repeal mean pro-growth for the economy? Lower taxes, bigger paychecks, more jobs? Lots of questions, so let's get to our panel. The first one I'm going to turn to is Grover Norquist, the nationally known, renowned, and respected, actually the globally known, renowned, and respected chairman of the appropriately named Americans for Tax Reform. Appropriate since the overall debate centers around tax reform, of a code that all agree is in need of a huge overhaul. It's so complex that over 90% of taxpayers are forced to hire tax experts to comply with the code. Grover, it's your mic, Mr. Tax Reformer himself.
Thank you. We've talked about getting rid of the death tax for a while now and had some success, had some votes, most recent votes in 2015. Every single Republican except Walter Jones in the House voted to get rid of it, and I forget Walter's reasoning, but I think he'll be with us this time. And every vote except Susan Collins, every Republican except Susan Collins in the Senate in 2015. But now it's going to be attached to a broader package, and so even somebody who may have voted against it, not that there were many Republicans, the 2, now have to look at the whole package. You know the outline, what we're going to be focusing on. We're taking the business taxes down from 35% to 20%, from 44% for pass-throughs down to 25%. And why we're doing this is to make us competitive. And we've noticed that other countries have been taking their business taxes down. Socialist China, mainland China, has a 25% rate. We're at 35. The socialists are at 25. The Canadians at their national level are at 15. The Brits are at 18. We're not competitive. That's also true about the death tax. In 35% of the OECD countries don't tax when you give money to children, people in your heirs. And we have the 4th highest tax on the death tax of all the OECD countries in terms of handing money over to heirs. The average in Europe of the death tax is 15%, and we're at 40. Sweden has abolished the death tax. The guy who founded IKEA moved back to Sweden when they got rid of the death tax. Norway has gotten rid of the death tax as well. These are just recent efforts. So just as with the reduction in our business taxes, which is to be pro-growth and to be internationally competitive, getting rid of the death tax fits in tax reform for both of those reasons. We just talked about international competitiveness. Right now, we're not competitive on the death tax. We need to be. But add to that on questions of economic growth. I'm looking at some tax foundation numbers. Their dynamic scoring of getting rid of the death tax, abolishing the death tax, would increase the economy by 0.8 of a point, almost 1% increase. 159,000 full-time jobs would be added, 159,000 full-time jobs. It would increase federal revenues by $145 billion over 10 years. Why? Because you'd actually have more money from the income taxes and other taxes, and when people aren't spending their time insuring around the death tax, nobody has to pay the death tax, you can insure around it, but it does distort the economy. And you can, in order to pay it, you can sell off the family business and give Uncle Sam their share of the money, but it does mean you have one fewer family business run by families. It may get bought up by a larger company. But also, getting rid of the death tax would increase the business capital stock by 2.5% or $850 billion total stock. I mean, think of the death tax as a tax on life savings. It is the most direct tax on savings. This is not consumption. This is a pure tax on savings, and we know that that has a history of slowing and damaging economic growth. So there's a reason why getting rid of the death tax is part of a pro-jobs, pro-growth, pro-competitive. Let's look around. What are our competitors doing to themselves? We're shooting ourselves in the foot, and they're reducing their business taxes, and they're reducing and getting rid of their death taxes. Jim Martin was talking about the times that the death tax was imposed in the United States. Civil War, the death tax was 5%. That was the top rate. Towards the end of the war, it went up as high as 6%. For the Spanish-American War, it was up as high as 15%. Remember, we're at 40. It went as high as 15%, and that was on estates larger than $22 million in today's dollars. Now $5 million, $5.5 million is exemption. World War I, it went to 10%. We're at 40. To pay for World War I, an emergency, we went to 10% on estates in today's dollars worth more than $96 million. We're at $5.5 million. We're not even competitive with our history. The death tax is way out of whack with where it's been. When it was funding emergencies, I don't know if the Spanish-American War counts as an emergency, but Civil War and World War I probably do. The Spanish-American War, we did get rid of the death tax. I don't know if people remember, but for 100 years we had that phone tax, the 3% federal excise tax on your phones. It finally went away because the courts took it out, not because we got Congress and the president to do that. So there's a lot to remember from the Spanish-American War, death tax being, unfortunately, one of them. There's also the question of fairness, and what I think is very interesting is that the left, which likes higher taxes, does so in the argument for envy and greed. It bothers them that somebody else has created wealth during their lifetime, and they think that envy is a political program instead of a vice. And you see that the attacks on every tax cut that's been proposed, from Reagan's tax cut in '81, that was it was across the board, 25% tax cut, but the argument was it's for the rich, and it's what's dragged out each time. And the good news is, and it doesn't bother me that the left is making this argument again, because we've met this argument and we've beat it again and again and again. The most recent polling data, consistent with long-term polling, was NPR's poll that 70% of the American people wanted to get rid of the death tax. Okay, and that's what you usually find in these. You know, this is not a tax that's paid by more than a few percent of the American people. But 70% recognize it is wrong and unfair and want to get rid of it. You may remember the anecdote out of the Nixon-McGovern race. McGovern said we should have 100% death tax on all estates, all lifetime savings above $500,000. So you have some tax on $500,000, but after that the government would take it all. And he discovered, in talking to blue-collar unionized workers, that they were appalled at this idea. And he sort of insulted them and said, "You'll never amount to anything. You'll never have those kind of savings." He said, "Well, I might not, but I might." and my children might, and my friends might, and it'd be wrong. So one of the healthiest signs in the United States is that on a tax that very few people look at and say, I'm going to pay this. They recognize it's wrong. They want to get rid of it because they just understand and sense that it's offensive from a question of social justice and fairness. But I wanted to open by talking about how it's bad for the economy. It's bad for economic growth. I mean, the 150,000 people who can get jobs, if we got rid of it, those people are walking around today. They don't have jobs today. And our friends on the left couldn't care less. They're pleased that somebody's getting screwed, and the fact that it's 150,000 plus individuals who don't have jobs, and people who don't have jobs are not rich. They're called poor because they don't have jobs. Those are exactly the people who would benefit most from getting rid of the death tax permanently. And then if we can avoid any wars, it won't come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Grover, Mr. Tax Reformer himself. I want to now turn to a champion of small business, Karen Kerrigan. Karen leads a national small business council. She speaks eloquently about the tax plan now being formulated as a big win for small businesses. Karen, your mic is on, and you can sit right there if you care to.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
I will do that. Well, good morning, everyone. The Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council is an advocacy, research, and education organization dedicated to protecting small business, promoting entrepreneurship. And for nearly 25 years now, we've been working on a range of issues and projects to strengthen the ecosystem for startups and small business growth. And I don't know what's left to say after Grover said it, but there's just a few points that I'll make from a small business perspective. There really is not any economic or fiscal justification for the imposition of a death tax. It destroys family-owned businesses. It sucks vast amount of resources that could be put into productive investment, wealth creation, and quality job creation as well. Our policies need to support businesses across the board, whether they're starting up or growing or in their 20th or 30th year. And we need every business that we can get our hands on or that exists in this country because, quite frankly, entrepreneurship is very weak in the U.S. There's a dearth in entrepreneurship. Several years ago, we were at a point where more businesses were exiting than were starting. We've sort of turned that around a little bit, but still, according to our research, our economy is missing 3.4 million businesses. So we need our businesses. We need policies that encourage startups. We need policies that encourage existing businesses to be able to invest in their businesses. And certainly we don't need to have policies that are sucking vast amount of resources out of businesses in order to either avoid the death tax or to pass it on to the next generation. Grover did talk about the framework and sort of obviously the tax reform and what that would mean for small businesses. Obviously, we think the pro-growth elements of it will be really good for startups. A lot of people are thinking about starting businesses. They are looking for robust growth in the economy to give them that extra confidence, if you will, to take the risk for existing businesses in terms of dropping that rate, whether they're structured as a C Corp or whether they're structured as an LLC, an S Corp, or a partnership. Dropping that top rate down to 25% is really going to allow them to keep those profits and invest it back into their businesses, and that's what businesses want to do. And then eliminating the death tax, I think, is really important too, for businesses that want to stay around and want to pass it on to the next generation. I mean, all this is good. All these tax pieces are really critical to our competitiveness and our economy and encouraging more entrepreneurship. So, I'll end again on just sort of going over the solid reasons for ending the death tax. It really does fail to provide any meaningful net revenue to the federal government, as it does reduce incentives for investing in entrepreneurship and increases the likelihood of businesses being closed or sold off. As noted, it imposes broad economic costs in terms of job destruction and business destruction. It is an unfair levy that is being imposed at death on total assets after a lifetime of paying taxes and fees. And in the end, repealing the death tax would boost private investment, productivity, income, and jobs. So, we're glad to see that the framework and the tax reform package includes death tax repeal because it is supposed to be about growth, fairness, and simplicity. And repealing the death tax, certainly strengthens all those goals. So with that, I'm done. Yeah, repeal the death tax.
Kill it, don't wound it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Karen. Job well done, well said. Before I call on our next panelist, I do want to make a comment that Grover had mentioned earlier, and Karen too, about the unfairness of this tax. I like to quote a liberal law professor who testified before the Ways and Means Committee a few years ago, Professor Edward McCaffrey. And he said before his opening statement, I was on the same panel with him, he said, "I'm an unrequited liberal, and I'm here to tell you that I used to believe in redistribution of wealth, but there are economic studies now show that if you leave the money with the rightful heirs, they'll do one of two good things. They'll invest money in existing businesses, or they'll invest in brand new startup businesses." And he says, guess what happens? They hire workers. And guess what workers do? They pay taxes. And he hinted on this note, he said, I think this is a tax that we liberals should love to hate. I didn't know there was such a tax, but we like to quote the liberal law professor who said we do need to repeal the death tax. Next to the microphone, though, I'm going to call someone that I've long admired. While young Palmer Schoening represents countless tax filers at all age levels, he's here leading the Family Business Council. Palmer's fairly new to the ways of Washington, but he's a quick study and he's developed a passion for leveling the playing field for all taxpayers. Palmer Schoening.
Great. Well, thanks for that nice intro, Jim. I've been fighting the death tax for about 10 years now, and I think between Grover and Karen, you guys, it's probably something like 50 to 100 years. So glad to be. Glad to be here with you guys.
I was an intern when I started, so.
Fair enough. I was too. Yeah. I worked on the 5th floor right by ATR, so I could come down and ask Grover everything, and then I'd go to our staff meetings, and I'd look like a genius. It was great. So I come at this from a similar perspective to Karen. I'm chairman of the Family Business Coalition. We started the group with about 20 organizations, and you can see our poster board over here. We're up to 150 different organizations. And so you'll see ATR, 60 Plus, SBE Council, but also some of the more well-known business groups, Associated Builders and Contractors, the Forest Landowners, even the Dude Ranchers Association is on this, in for death tax repeal. So we've grown the coalition quite a bit, and I think it's kind of illustrative of the broad swath of groups that support repeal. You often hear, well, this doesn't affect any businesses. Well, why do 150 different business associations want to focus in like a laser on this issue? So we sent a letter to Congress last month, and we made 5 main points on it with all these groups signed on. So I'll just kind of highlight those points. First is jobs, which has been talked about a little bit. 160,000 jobs, according to the Tax Foundation, could be created. And we also issued a letter signed by 727 economists pushing for death tax repeal. So, among the right-wing groups, among the business groups, among the academics, the economists, this is a policy that's supported strongly. Second, it's a tiny slice of federal revenue, and that was, I think, mentioned before as well, but 0.4 of 1% federal revenue. So if you look at a big pie chart, you look at the receipts from the federal government, a tiny, tiny slice, 0.4 of 1%. So we think for the amount that it raises, it's just not worth having in place for the damage that it causes. Compliance costs as well. So it's not just the 40% tax at death, but every single year during a business owner's lifetime, they have to pay for lawyers and accountants, they have to pay for the planning, and that's just a drain of capital out of those businesses for every single year until they get to the point where they actually pay the death tax. So it's a huge waste of money in the economy, a deadweight loss in the economy. Third is public support. 76% of people, according to an NPR poll, and I'll say that again, that was an NPR poll, 76% of people support repealing the death tax. And it doesn't matter how you ask it. You can ask them, do you support repealing the estate tax, death tax, inheritance tax? The percentages are relatively similar, 60 to 70%, pretty consistently. Fourth, it's just simply unfair. It makes no sense to force a grieving family to pay a 40% tax on their nest egg. You'll have the IRS agents coming in and counting up spoons. That's the actual moral effect of this on a grieving family. So just think of that. The incidence of death as a taxable event just should not be in place. So that's what we want to change. You know, there's taxes all the way up until you get to death. We just want to remove death as a taxable event. You can make an argument that you want to tax those same people, but there's definitely better ways to do it than taxing death. It creates all sorts of problems. Fifth, repeal of support in Congress. Passed the House 240 to 179. 7 Democrats joined. I think, Jim, you'll probably talk about Sanford Bishop, who's the lead House sponsor on that. And in the Senate, 5 Democrats have voted for repeal at least once in the past. And those Democrats are Murray, Feinstein, Nelson, Manchin, and Wyden. So Senator Wyden, who is kind of taken the helm as the not one penny for the 1% messaging guru during this Congress, has voted for a complete elimination of the estate tax twice. So that's not just elimination on some people, that's voting to completely eliminate it from the tax code. And so those are kind of our high-level points in the Senate. There was a recent budget amendment last year that got 54 bipartisan votes. We picked up Senator Manchin. Senator Collins, I think, remains a question on this, but there's strong support in Congress, strong support with the right wing and the business groups, and strong support with economists as well. So happy to open it up to the conversation here, Jim.
Before we do that, and before I go back to Grover and the other panelists, I would like to comment on the why we've started calling it the death tax, the grave robbers tax. We started holding a contest a few years ago. We would offer at CPAC college kids $100 cash, no questions asked, to come up with another name. They started winning this contest, coming up with names like the afterlife tax, the pine box tax, feet first tax, the tombstone tax, the last goodbye tax, the long goodbye tax, the one we like perhaps best of all, the stiffest tax of all. You know, but we added some levity to this gruesome topic by doing that. And again, quoting the self-described unrequited liberal Professor Edward McCaffrey, he said, quote, "To most people, death seems like the wrong time to tax." And again, Palmer, I'll mention Sanford Bishop. I'm glad you did that because Senator Schumer the other day, after President Trump was in North Dakota talking about getting rid of the death tax, and he cited a farm family that's impacted by it, Senator Schumer said, "Oh, it's just another tax cut for the rich." I think if he talks in his sleep, he probably, the first thing he yells out in his sleep is tax cut for the rich. Well, I want to refer him to a fellow Democratic colleague, Sanford Bishop, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus in Georgia. Congressman Bishop is not only voting to repeal it, as he's done in the past in the House, he is a co-sponsor with Chairman Kevin Brady, House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Brady's bill to repeal the estate or death tax. He said, "I'm here to talk about my peanut farmers in Plains, Georgia," Jimmy Carter's hometown. He once told Jennifer Dunn at a meeting when she was on Ways and Means Committee, he said, "Listen," he said, I went down to Georgia and did a campaign years ago in Albany and was giving his opponent a pro-senior award. And he was asked about the death tax, and he said, we should do something about reforming it. And he told Jennifer Dunn, and I'm not quoting her verbatim, but she told me, she says, Mr. Bishop said he was out talking to some of his peanut farmers the next day, and they said, Congressman Bishop, we vote for you, we like you, but said that daggone estate tax impacts us. he was talking to a bunch of peanut farmers in dirty overalls and muddy boots. And again, the bottom line is they are asset and land rich, but cash poor, and they don't have the financial wherewithal to hire those pricey lawyers I talked about earlier to avoid it. But again, I want to go back to Grover, and anybody else in Grover, if you'd care to add some more comments, we'd sure like to hear you do so. Thank you.
Good news is that as we look at this fall, I believe that not only would the tax reform itself pass, it's got strong support in the House and Senate. The Republicans can lose 2 senators, and one can imagine losing 2, but I don't see losing 3. And even the people who've raised questions about X, Y, or Z are all doing so in a publicly stated drive to get to yes. When somebody says, I don't know about X, I call them and say, what are you thinking? And said, well, I'd like to get these changes. I'll vote for the bill if I don't, but I can't tell anyone that. So we're negotiating by throwing up concerns, but not in a way, not with the goal of undermining the whole package. This has been part of the package. The death tax has been a part of the package for a long time. It was awkwardly put into the 2001 tax cut that Bush had. They sort of phased it in. For 1 year, it was fully gone. But what it also tells, even in that sort of awkward way of doing it, because you don't get any of the benefits of abolishing it in the sense of allowing people to not have to insure around it or organize their lives around it. If it's only gone 1 year, it's like a roulette wheel, and you can't count on dying in 2010. Although I expected more murder mysteries to flow from that. That opportunity, the way sort of Agatha Christie's has quite a number of uncles who have to go at certain times. Everybody who voted for that got themselves reelected. There wasn't any backlash. There wasn't any sense of the only sense of unfairness was, isn't it unfair that only in this 1 year it's not a taxable event and then it comes back. So we've learned that it's politically popular to do it. There isn't. People do understand. Politicians go, is it safe when they talk about a particular piece of legislation? They worry that if something passes, it bounces somehow and can come back to bite them. But we've road tested this. Not only when we got rid of it after the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, when Spain so viciously attacked us, and World War I, and each time, except for World War I, we got it in. We also got rid of it, and this was a popular political position to take. So the politics of it work out. It fits inside the larger idea of being more competitive. It's also massive tax simplification. Think of all the material and information people don't have to keep in their lives. You know, how much gold do you have in your teeth? What's in the basement? And what's in the attic? Let's go look at it all. It's tremendous tax simplification. It's a reduction, tremendous reduction on tax on capital, on savings, life savings. So it fits in with the rest of the effort that we're driving at. But it also has it's politically popular. It gets attacked, but we know that attack doesn't work, because you can see it in the polls that people reject that argument, the one that they've heard again and again.
Karen or Palmer, you care to follow up?
I mean, the only thing I would add is another piece of sort of the fairness and the equity, part of this. If you look at where where all the opportunity is, and where we don't have economic growth, and some of the communities that have been left behind. I mean, those are in rural America. The Economic Innovation Group did a really good study, this fabulous map, in terms of, where the jobs are, where the opportunity is, where the business creation is occurring, and it's not happening in rural. It's been a total sort of switch, in terms of rural and suburban, exurban. I think is exurban or rural. I think that's the proper term. And so, I mean, that's why you do have the ranchers, the farmers, the dude, is it the dude ranchers?
Yeah,
The
they're on
dude, and all
board.
those, really, what you want them to be doing is, again, encouraging the growth and encouraging them to be investing, in those enterprises, being globally competitive, and they will create more opportunities if that money, is actually put to more productive uses in those communities. So I think that's another important, piece of this. I think that really will help, particularly in rural, America as well. I mean, there's other things that need to happen, access to broadband, all of that. But certainly, I think this is an important piece, and why it makes sense that it's in the tax framework.
Speaking of those farmers and ranchers and the cost of land, now with that $5.5 million exemption, everybody says, well, that takes care of everybody. Well, look, a lot of that farmland years ago was just a few pennies on the acre, but as it's grown up, as cities have grown up near it, it has grown in cost and value exponentially. So the 5.49 million or 11 million for a couple, can be eaten up quickly. Let me.
If that election, if this last election, 2016, had gone the other way, and a lot of people thought that Hillary was likely to win, she campaigned saying she wanted to take the rate from 40 up to 65%, and that threshold down. So if you leave the death tax in at all, it will eventually, the rate will creep back up again, and in addition, they'll bring the numbers down because they can't get enough money taxing billionaires. They have to go down and get down to where people, after $1 million, they take half of it or whatever. So the reason to get rid of it, you don't compare what we have today with getting rid of it. You compare what we have today will grow into if we don't get rid of it, and that's a bigger delta.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I want to quote from an excerpt from people who send comments to the 60 Plus Association. Grover mentioned a while ago something about the gold out of a person's teeth. Kind of macabre, but look, a couple of excerpts I brought. First of all, the very first one I like most is from a former IRS agent. He said, quote, "I've spent most of my adult life in tax as an agent, the IRS agent. I've always disagreed with an estate or inheritance tax. Why? It discourages savings and encourages waste." One other point, I've got to read this one. Another person wrote, "I'm very intrigued about that an organization such as yours, the onerous death tax is akin to stealing the very gold out of a dead man's teeth while he lies stone cold and defenseless. It is no less evil than stealing a dead man's wallet and credit cards while he lies dead in the street after a fatal car accident, unable to resist." A person out in California wrote us that. Must be a couple of conservatives still out in California. Palmer?
Yeah, well, I was just going to bring up state death taxes. So there's a lot of talk about the 40% federal death tax, but 18 states plus D.C. have some additional transfer tax. In Washington State, that's up to 20%. So you could be looking at an effective tax rate of near 60% on the estate tax, depending on where you die. And so I always tell folks, don't die in Washington, don't die in New Jersey or Maryland, who have both estate and inheritance taxes. They have both.
Well, Governor Pataki used to say, trying to get rid of his inheritance tax, he said, a lot of our seniors aren't moving to Florida and Arizona just for the sunshine. They're taking their assets and going elsewhere where there is no estate tax.
Right. And on the state level, it's less of a political football. It's more about attracting jobs and attracting retirees. So you'll see even blue states, New York raising up their exemption, Maryland, Maine is another good example of that, mostly a Democrat state, Republican governor. But even blue states are reducing the burden of the estate tax, and it's simply to attract more jobs and attract more retirees. And us as a country, we compete in the same way with the rest of the world. So why is it such a political football on the federal level?
Absolutely.
New Jersey abolished the death tax.
They did.
Yeah.
Yep.
We,
Jim and I were on the stairs of the Trenton Capitol pushing for that.
years
So-
ago pushing for it. By the way, talking about the tax on the telephones, Grover mentioned it earlier, we finally got that repealed. Clearly, the tax on the wealthy to help finance war efforts, true. But back then, too, the Spanish-American War, they put a tax on the telephones because I think Grover pointed out at a conference years ago that there are only like 15,000 phones in the country, so therefore only the wealthy could afford a telephone. Well, the time we did it in early 2000s, I think Matsui, a Democrat from California, and Rob Portman, a House member from Ohio, put in a bill to repeal it. Why? Because no longer were there only 15,000 phones, there were millions and millions and millions of phones, and it was bringing in a nice chunk of money for the federal government. And so we did work together and got that one repealed. Okay, anybody care to make a further comment or two? Anybody? We've got a microphone out in the audience there. If anybody has a question, just state your name and the organization you're with, and
Not required.
not required. Yeah, yours.
Jim, and I'm a recent joinee of 60 Plus, but I spent years doing the regulatory and paperwork issue, and I think Grover very eloquently stated that much of the consequence of the death tax goes to those who have to plan, have to fill out the paperwork, have to fill out the regulations, comport with the life insurance agencies. But here's my question: we're looking at doing the first round of tax cuts on reconciliation. Now, the opponents will get a CBO, a Congressional Budget Office number, that says, hey, you have to have some payback, despite all the costs that are involved with it, because they don't count the regulatory compliance costs. So I just want to present to the board that the argument is so overwhelming, but if we get hung up on reconciliation, the political support is there to, in fact, perhaps get 60 if someone shoots for a budget waiver, and secondly, doing this independently. And I just want to raise that specter, because we are going to have to deal probably with a Congressional Budget Office number that says it's a revenue loser because of their methodology, and that's going to be the Democrats' handle.
I don't think we've played this game with the Democrats on the death tax, where Wyden votes for it when he's in cycle and then not when he isn't. Our friend Pryor, on his website, and constantly saying he was for it until it came to a vote. There are there are several handful of Democrats who will tell you they want to get rid of the death tax, and have historically even voted to do so when they were within a matter of months of an election. North and South Dakota used to be filled with Democrats like this, and they would take turns voting for it when they were in cycle and vote against it when they were 4 and 6 years away from getting reelected. So I don't think there is a Democratic vote for either getting rid of the death tax or for overall tax reform if the vote matters. Now, once we have 51 votes, you could see 2 or 3 people try and save themselves in the 2018 election, but those votes won't matter. And the way to know whether a Democrat's actually in favor of tax reform or getting rid of the death tax is whether they vote for the budget, which allows us to get to the tax cut. And my guess is not one will.
Bob, you bring up another good point about macroeconomic scoring. So the static score of this doesn't take into account how people change their behavior because of the death tax. A more proper macroeconomic score by the Tax Foundation shows only an $18 billion impact over 10 years versus a $240 billion impact. Now, that's a big difference. So I think, the future of this tax bill is going to depend on how we're able to either use the scorekeepers in Congress to make a more realistic estimate, or subvert the scorekeepers in Congress and do it through the Treasury Department.
Bad scoring, it's not just dynamic versus static. These guys operate on the basis that the rest of the world doesn't exist. And they say, gee, if you borrow money for the deficit, that comes out of this fixed amount of capital here in the United States, and they have a world where there are no Canadians with any money, and no British people with any money, and no Chinese people with any money, where if there's a good investment, we would be able to have lots of money. You don't crowd, you crowd out something if you have a closed system, but we don't have a closed system. The rest of the world does exist, and we love it when they send us their money to invest. And sometimes they even buy government bonds. So if you have debt, it doesn't necessarily come out of American pockets in the first place. And yet these characters who want to limit our ability to reduce taxes have imagined a world. Sometimes they can announce that half of the world exists. So they have this theory that there's a certain amount of crowding out because half of the world exists, but they then announce that the other half of the world doesn't. So there's half crowding out, which is even worse, because then at least you're admitting that you know what you're doing and you're fudging it. The other was just stupid. This is calculated stupid. But I think we'll just have to live with that and go through.
If I could make another comment on those who set up trusts and foundations, I mentioned it cuts across the political spectrum, left to right. I mentioned Edward McCaffrey, an unrequited liberal, law professor. I remember Oprah Winfrey was doing a show a few years ago about the rich and the famous. And during that show, Grover, the fellow was talking about the tax on your estate. And she said, just a moment, she's going on commercial break. She got a big laugh. She said, wait a minute, I'm being taxed 50% while I'm alive, and I want to leave that to my aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews. You're saying they can tax me 55%, that was the rate at the time, when I pass away? I find that irritating, to say the least, she added, and got a big round of applause. She came back on the show, and she talked about the issue again, and this fellow said, Oprah, you need to set up a foundation. And she said, oh, so he walked her through it, and I made a prediction at the time in a press conference later, in fact, with the chairman of Ways and Means, who put it on his website, what she replied. I said, I bet she walked backstage after the show. She probably told her staff, I want to do that. They probably said, well, we have to cut some checks and, to set up the foundation. And she probably said, don't bother me with the details. Cut the checks, I'll sign them. She had that type of financial capital, of course, at her disposal. So I said, I'll bet you she sets up a foundation. Why? She wants to have some say-so on those assets that she's earned while she's alive and after she's gone. So I predicted there'd be an Oprah Winfrey Foundation. Not almost 2 years to the day later, in the Investor's Business Daily front page, one of those rags to riches stories that you always say, great picture of Oprah Winfrey and talking about how she had come from nothing. And I scanned down around the 40th graph. It said, the recently formed Oprah Winfrey Foundation, and it talked about how she was helping ladies throughout Africa get an education. That was an inspiring story to me. She comes from a decidedly liberal viewpoint. I point that out because it does cut across philosophical lines. One other thing on Schumer, when he talks about tax cut for the rich, he ought to talk to fellow Democrat Sanford Bishop. He probably ought to reach out to, is it his niece, Amy Schumer? She is impacted by it. She says, let's get rid of that death tax. She ought to talk to her uncle.
That's a good point about foundations that you bring up, Jim, because the ultra wealthy are able to plan around the tax. And so what you really have is a transfer of wealth from maybe the moderately wealthy and some of those family businesses into the multinational conglomerations like Warren Buffett owns, for example. And through Berkshire Hathaway, he owns 7 life insurance companies. So he's not just altruistically saying, let's raise the death tax. You don't stay one of the top 2 richest people in the world by accident. He knows what he's doing. He's making money off the death tax, and he won't pay it.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember a few years ago, Palmer and I were at a hearing, and Buffett was testifying, and I walked up to him later, and I said, besides the death, he said, this fellow keeps calling it the death tax and all that onerous things. And I walked up and I said, Mr. Buffett, if you want to keep it in your honor, we'll name it a voluntary tax. If you want to voluntarily pay it, we'll send you the address of the IRS. And he walked away rather swiftly. folks, if we don't have any other comments, we would perhaps close on this note. I hope that this back and forth has given you some ammunition as you go out and talk about the issue. And again, I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank our audience. I want to thank everybody that's been tuned in on this issue. And even though our time is not really up, I thank you most sincerely for yours. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim.